25,000 people go to sleep every single night on land that did not exist 20 years ago, on sand that was sucked up from the floor of the Arabian Gulf, sprayed through the air in a giant arc, and shaped by hand into a tree the size of Hyde Park, sitting in open water where there used to be nothing but waves. What you're looking at when you see this island from above is not natural in any sense of the word. Every single grain of sand, beneath every villa, every road, every palm tree on this island was placed there deliberately, engineered, positioned, and locked into place by people who, when they started, had absolutely no blueprint to follow because nobody on Earth had ever tried to build something quite like this before. In 2001, a ruler of Dubai looked at a stretch of open sea and requested something that sounded almost absurd on paper. An island shaped like a palm tree, rising out of the Gulf, visible from space, and engineers were essentially handed that request with no existing playbook, forced to invent the entire process as they went, figuring out solutions to problems nobody had ever formally documented because nobody had ever needed to. To even begin, they needed sand, an almost unbelievable quantity of it, 94 million cubic meters in total, enough material that if you lined it all up, you could circle the entire planet twice over. But here's the detail. Almost nobody outside the engineering world knows. The fine, soft desert sand sitting right there on the mainland, the sand tourists picture when they think of Dubai, was completely useless for this project. Desert sand grains are too smooth, too rounded from centuries of wind erosion, meaning they simply slide against each other and refuse to lock into a stable structure. So instead, engineers dredged rougher, coarser sand directly from the floor of the Gulf itself, sand with jagged edges capable of interlocking under pressure, sand that could actually hold its shape once compacted. The process used to move that sand into position looks almost like a strange kind of art form from above. It's called rainbowing, where massive dredging ships spray plumes of wet sand high into the air in a controlled arc, landing in the exact position dictated by GPS coordinates fed to the captain in real time, essentially painting an island onto the surface of the ocean, one enormous spray at a time. But before a single grain of sand could even be placed for the island itself, engineers first had to solve a much more fundamental problem, because raw, exposed sand sitting in open water is completely defenseless against the ocean. A serious storm would simply wash the entire structure away within days. So the very first thing built here wasn't the palm at all. It was a wall, an 11-kilometer breakwater, a massive barrier constructed from 3 separate layers of rock, engineered specifically to absorb and dissipate wave energy before it could ever reach the fragile sand structures being built behind it. That breakwater alone required 7 million tons of rock, blasted directly out of mountains and shipped to the construction site. And hidden inside its structure is a specially engineered membrane whose entire job is to stop sand from slowly leaching out from behind the wall and undermining the whole barrier from within over time. The wall itself functions almost like a giant wave filter, taking swells that might otherwise reach 2 meters high out in open water and reducing them down to roughly 30 centimeters by the time they reach the calm interior lagoon, transforming genuinely dangerous open ocean into something closer to a swimming pool. But even before construction crews could start placing that rock, they had to do something that surprised almost everyone involved: relocate roughly 2,000 fish by hand from the area. A deliberate, careful environmental step taken before a single boulder was dropped into the water. Divers spent extensive time mapping the seabed itself, discovering loose, unstable sediment across large sections of the planned footprint, sediment that would never be able to support a permanent structure without significant reinforcement first. More than 100 separate studies were conducted just to understand the exact conditions of this particular stretch of seafloor before construction could responsibly begin. To guide a project with essentially zero precedent to draw from, Dubai brought in Dutch engineering specialists, a nation whose entire modern existence has depended for centuries on reclaiming usable land from the sea, and together they even launched a private satellite, specifically to provide the precision positioning data needed for a construction site, where no meaningful land-based reference points existed at all. About a year into construction, engineers ran into a problem nobody had fully anticipated. Water trapped inside the newly forming lagoon simply wasn't circulating properly, and in the punishing heat of the Gulf, stagnant water like that risked becoming a genuine environmental disaster, breeding conditions that could kill marine life and create serious water quality issues for the eventual residents. The fix was surprisingly elegant. Engineers cut 2 deliberate gaps directly into the breakwater wall, allowing natural tidal movement to flush water in and out of the interior lagoon on a regular cycle, and those same gaps were later converted into bridges, doubling as both a structural solution and a functional roadway, connecting the outer crescent to the mainland. And in one of the more unexpected outcomes of the entire project, that massive rock breakwater, originally built purely as a wave barrier, gradually transformed into one of the best artificial reef systems anywhere in the Gulf, its rough rock surfaces providing ideal shelter for marine life, eventually supporting more biodiversity than the flat, featureless natural seafloor that existed there before construction ever began. With the breakwater complete and functioning, attention shifted to the actual fronds of the palm itself, built entirely from dredged sand requiring an extraordinary level of precision from the dredging crews, whose ship captains watched satellite guidance screens constantly, spraying sand with an accuracy closer to painting a canvas than anything typically associated with heavy marine construction. But raw, freshly placed sand, no matter how precisely positioned, is fundamentally loose and unstable, completely unsuitable to build permanent structures on top of without further treatment. The solution was a process called vibrocompaction, using long vibrating steel probes driven directly into the sand, physically shaking the loose grains until they settled tightly against one another and locked into a genuinely dense, stable mass capable of bearing real structural weight. Across the full project, crews drilled roughly 200,000 separate compaction points over the course of 2 years, methodically working across the entire island footprint until the loose, dredged sand had been transformed into ground, solid enough to be considered genuinely rock-like, engineered to resist the erosive forces of the ocean for decades to come. At the peak of construction, crews were placing 86,000 tons of sand every single day, sustained continuously for 3 straight years. An almost unbelievable industrial pace applied to a project that, on paper, still sounded more like ambitious, a fantasy than achievable engineering. Once the sand had been properly compacted and stabilized, the project shifted into an entirely different phase, building the actual infrastructure of a functioning city, directly on top of what had, until recently, been nothing but seabed. Engineers drilled deep beneath the newly formed land to run utility connections invisibly between the different fronds of the palm, bearing water, electricity, and telecommunications lines well below the surface rather than running anything exposed across the delicate sand structure above. To connect the entire island complex to the wider hotel development on the outer crescent, engineers actually dammed off a section of the Gulf and pumped the seawater completely out of the area, creating a dry construction zone in the middle of the ocean specifically to build an underwater tunnel using 30,000 tons of steel, a 6-lane roadway that today sits 25 meters beneath the surface of the sea, connecting directly to the Atlantis resort on the crescent. Once again, roughly 2,000 fish had to be carefully relocated by hand before that particular phase of underwater construction could safely proceed. Above that tunnel, engineers also built a driverless monorail system, the very first of its kind anywhere in the Middle East, now carrying around 20,000 passengers every single day between the mainland and the resort development out on the crescent. To make the entire island feel finished and lived in far faster than it actually was, developers grew roughly 12,000 palm trees in dedicated nurseries well before construction was complete, allowing them to transplant fully mature trees directly onto the island the moment sand compaction was finished, rather than waiting years for saplings to grow in place. By 2006, just 5 years after construction first began, the very first residents had already moved into their new homes on the island, an almost unbelievable timeline for a project of this scale and complexity. In 2008, the Atlantis resort officially opened on the outer crescent with what was, at the time, the largest fireworks display the world had ever seen, a spectacle deliberately designed to announce the island's arrival on the global stage. But unlike so many other ambitious real estate developments, built purely to be admired from a distance, this island quickly became a genuine, functioning neighborhood, complete with schools, medical clinics, and supermarkets, serving the actual daily needs of the people who chose to live there. Within 6 years of construction beginning, roughly 25,000 residents were calling this reclaimed island home, transforming what had once been open ocean into one of the most recognizable residential addresses on the planet. In the years since completion, NASA satellite imagery detected extremely slight settling in parts of the island's structure, though engineers subsequently confirmed this was simply normal, expected sand consolidation rather than any sign of structural failure. A natural process that engineering teams monitor continuously as part of routine maintenance. Water quality across the surrounding lagoon requires constant active monitoring, particularly during the brutal summer months when Gulf water temperatures regularly climb past 37 degrees, conditions that could otherwise threaten both marine life and the overall health of the artificial ecosystem surrounding the island. To help support that ecosystem, artificial reef structures were deliberately added around the island over time. And during the unusually quiet period of the COVID pandemic, dolphins were actually spotted swimming near the island, widely interpreted by marine biologists as an encouraging sign of genuinely improving water quality in the surrounding lagoon. Natural wave action continues to erode the outer edges of the fronds over time, meaning engineering crews regularly need to add fresh sand back onto vulnerable areas simply to maintain the island's original designed shoreline shape. Engineers designed the entire lagoon system so that its water would fully renew itself roughly every 13 days through natural tidal flushing. And remarkably, real-world monitoring after completion confirmed that the actual water renewal rate matched almost exactly what the original models had predicted before a single grain of sand was ever placed. Consider what those exact coordinates once represented: empty open ocean, water with nothing beneath it but seabed, transformed within a matter of years into a thriving residential city, home to 25,000 people, its sheltered internal channels functioning precisely as the original fractal geometry had promised. Proof that the entire palm tree concept wasn't just visually striking, but genuinely, functionally sound engineering. That specific fractal palm shape wasn't chosen purely for aesthetics either. It was a deliberate mathematical solution to a very real problem, because Dubai desperately wanted to establish itself as a premier beach destination despite having remarkably little natural coastline to work with. Engineers essentially asked themselves which possible island shape could generate the maximum amount of usable beachfront within a fixed ocean footprint. And the answer that emerged was exactly this kind of branching, frond-based structure, ultimately delivering 17 separate fronds and roughly 34 distinct beach areas from a single connected island, rather than the mere handful of beaches a simple circular or rectangular island shape could have ever provided. The completed project added a genuinely staggering 78 kilometers of new coastline to the emirate, more than doubling Dubai's entire original natural beach frontage in one single construction effort, and ultimately created around 1,500 individual beachfront properties, compared to the roughly 200 that traditional coastal development in the region might have realistically produced from a comparable stretch of land. Every villa built along those fronds enjoys direct, private beach access, a design outcome that was never accidental, but rather the entire mathematical point of choosing this particular shape in the first place. Perched at the very top of the development, the 52nd floor of the tallest tower on the island offers the only true vantage point from which residents and visitors can actually see the full palm shape spread out below them, since anyone standing at ground level on the island itself has absolutely no visual sense of the tree-like pattern they're actually walking through. A striking irony, given that the entire form was originally engineered specifically to be recognized from space. Out on the crescent itself, the Atlantis resort now houses roughly 65,000 animals across its various marine attractions, all built on a crescent of land constructed entirely from blasted mountain rock. And in 2022, an even more expansive resort called the Royal Atlantis opened alongside it. Clear proof that development along that outer crescent continues to accelerate rather than plateau even decades after the original project began. Palm-adjacent properties now routinely sell at a substantial premium compared to equivalent real estate on Dubai's mainland, reflecting the enduring prestige and exclusivity attached to owning land on what is still considered one of the most expensive residential islands anywhere in the Middle East. And yet, despite that extreme exclusivity, there's a full 6-kilometer public boardwalk that wraps entirely around the outer crescent, completely free and open to anyone who wants to walk it. An unusual and deliberate touch of public accessibility layered directly into one of the most expensive pieces of real estate on the planet. Running invisibly beneath the frond channels are 12 separate pipeline systems, carrying water, electrical power, and telecommunications. Infrastructure horizontally underground at depths between 13 and 16 meters below the seabed. An entire hidden second layer of city infrastructure that virtually none of the island's residents ever think about as they go about their daily lives. That original 11-kilometer breakwater wall has now been quietly absorbing wave energy for more than 2 decades, protecting everyone living behind it without a single second of public attention, having weathered 2 full decades of Gulf storms while 5,000 residents slept peacefully each night, entirely unaware of just how much structural engineering was standing between them and the open sea. The broader economic story surrounding this project is almost as dramatic as the engineering itself. Dubai's entire economy generated roughly $7 billion in gross domestic product back in 1990. By 2024, that figure had climbed to approximately $120 billion. And while this single island obviously wasn't the sole driver of that transformation, it became one of the most visible, most photographed symbols of exactly the kind of ambition that fueled Dubai's broader economic reinvention. The very day this project was first announced, back in 2001, global search interest in Dubai spiked dramatically. Journalists from around the world flew in specifically to document the construction process as it unfolded, and tourists began arriving simply to watch the island grow in real time, long before a single villa was ready for occupancy, proof that the marketing value of this project began accumulating years before its actual completion. That iconic branching palm silhouette wasn't a happy visual accident either. It was deliberately engineered from the very beginning to be globally recognizable, instantly identifiable from satellite photography, a literal piece of branding built directly into the geography of the coastline itself. Originally, Dubai actually planned 2 additional, even larger palm-shaped islands beyond this first one, but the devastating 2008 global financial crisis brought both of those more ambitious follow-up projects to a complete halt, leaving this original island, known formally as Palm Jumeirah, as the sole fully completed example of the concept, a project that, remarkably, finished construction just 6 weeks before that same financial crisis began tearing through global markets. Unlike a number of other headline-grabbing developments around the world that were built primarily to impress rather than to actually function, this particular island succeeded specifically because people genuinely chose to live there permanently, turning what could have been an empty architectural showpiece into a real, breathing neighborhood instead. The original construction investment, estimated at roughly $12 billion, ultimately generated something in the neighborhood of $50 billion in property sales alone, an extraordinary return that helped validate the entire concept of manufactured land as a legitimate, profitable form of urban development rather than simply an expensive novelty. Today, daily maintenance crews continue irrigating the island's mature trees and inspecting infrastructure around the clock, quietly keeping an entire artificial city looking immaculate on top of what remains, fundamentally, compacted seabed sand rather than natural ground. Because the island has no independent natural water source, fresh water is desalinated on the mainland and piped directly out to the island to serve its full resident population, an entirely engineered water supply chain supporting tens of thousands of daily lives. The government-linked developer that originally built the island, Nakheel, continues to actively manage it today, regulating new construction, overseeing ongoing water quality monitoring, and maintaining the delicate balance between commercial development and residential livability across the entire site. Interestingly, the beaches themselves subtly widen and narrow on a daily basis as the island responds to natural tidal movement, a small but constant reminder that despite decades of engineering permanence, this land still exists in an active, ongoing relationship with the sea surrounding it. More than 2 decades after construction began, that original breakwater wall has genuinely matured into a functioning coral and marine ecosystem, showing real, measurable ecological recovery rather than remaining simply an inert pile of engineered rock. At roughly 4 times the total size of Hyde Park in London, built entirely from material dredged directly out of the seafloor, the sheer scale of transforming open ocean into a complete, functioning city within just 6 years remains one of the most genuinely astonishing timelines in the history of modern land reclamation anywhere on Earth. At dawn, when morning haze still hangs low over the water, the hand-shaped crescent and the branching fronds of the island slowly emerge into view, a daily visual reminder of just how deliberately every single contour of this landscape was designed and placed by human hands rather than left to chance. Despite receiving as many as 40,000 visitors on a single day, the island's deliberately dead-end frond streets were specifically designed to preserve genuine residential privacy and quiet along the actual villa-lined roads, keeping tourist traffic largely concentrated near the crescent and away from the everyday lives of permanent residents. At the absolute peak of construction, roughly 40,000 workers were simultaneously building villas, roads, and infrastructure across all 17 fronds at once, an enormous coordinated labor effort unfolding across an area that, just a few years earlier, had been nothing but open water. Long before the island was anywhere close to finished, buyers around the world placed enormous trust in Dubai's broader development ambitions, purchasing individual villas on a piece of land that, at the time of sale, technically did not yet physically exist. The completed island ultimately organizes itself into 3 genuinely distinct zones: a dense, high-rise trunk section near the mainland connection, quieter, more residential, villa-lined fronds branching outward, and finally the resort-focused Hotel Crescent, forming the outer, protective boundary of the entire structure. A dedicated shopping mall built directly on the island allows residents to handle the vast majority of their everyday shopping needs without ever having to leave the Palm at all, reinforcing the island's identity as a genuinely self-contained community rather than merely a tourist attraction. With functioning schools and medical clinics integrated directly into daily island life, the development effectively operates as an unusually expensive, entirely artificial suburb built on top of engineered, compacted sand rather than natural coastal terrain. In the broadest sense, this project directly solved Dubai's original beach shortage problem, ultimately proving itself to be a genuinely successful long-term economic solution rather than simply an expensive experiment in ambitious architecture. At night, illuminated streetlights tracing the outline of every frond render the entire palm shape clearly visible from orbit. Exactly as originally intended back when the project was first conceived in 2001, The very same private satellite system originally launched purely to guide the precision placement of sand during construction now continues operating in a very different role, quietly monitoring the completed island for any signs of unexpected structural movement over time. The documented appearance of dolphins near the island during the unusually quiet COVID period continues to be cited by marine biologists as meaningful evidence that overall water quality in the surrounding lagoon has genuinely measurably recovered and stabilized since construction ended. Taken together, the entire project effectively proved something that many engineers considered borderline impossible at the time it was first proposed: that permanent, genuinely habitable land really can be manufactured from open ocean, given sufficient engineering expertise, financial investment, and sheer determination to see the concept through to completion. After roughly 15 years of pause, largely driven by the lingering effects of the 2008 financial crisis, Dubai has now restarted active construction on a second, considerably larger palm-shaped island, this time drawing directly on more than 2 decades of hard-won engineering data, collected from the ongoing performance of the original Jumeirah palm. Beyond that second, larger palm, 4 additional new islands are now under active development as well, each one directly building on lessons learned from this original, groundbreaking experiment in manufactured land. In many ways, this first island has become something closer to a permanent blueprint for Dubai's broader, long-term strategy of manufacturing usable land directly out of the sea whenever natural geography simply fails to provide what an ambitious growing city actually needs. That original 11-kilometer crescent of rock now effectively functions as a massive, continuously operating machine for living, working quietly around the clock to protect an entire artificial neighborhood that depends on it completely, whether its residents ever consciously think about it or not. Perhaps the single most powerful lesson embedded inside this entire project is a remarkably simple one. Geography, it turns out, is not actually fixed, and with enough genuine engineering, will, financial commitment, and sheer stubborn persistence, it is entirely possible to physically redraw the map itself. 17 years after its original completion, this island has settled into something almost mundane by comparison to its dramatic origin story. A completely normal functioning part of the city, with people commuting to work, walking their dogs, and going about entirely ordinary daily lives on top of land that, not so very long ago, quite literally did not exist at all. It's worth pausing occasionally to genuinely remember that fact, that this specific stretch of coastline, now home to tens of thousands of people going about entirely unremarkable daily routines, simply did not exist as usable land until somebody made the deliberate, almost audacious decision to create it from nothing. Curiously, that instantly recognizable, branching palm silhouette, the exact shape that made this island globally famous and visible from orbit, remains almost completely invisible to anyone actually standing on the island itself, experienced instead purely through satellite photography, aerial footage, and the collective global imagination rather than through any direct view available to the people who actually live there every day. Ultimately, Dubai needed significantly more usable coastline than nature had ever provided it. And this particular project didn't just solve that narrow practical problem, it delivered an entirely new, globally recognized identity for the entire emirate in the process. Today, nothing more than a short connecting bridge separates this roughly $12 billion engineered island from the rest of mainland Dubai. A deceptively simple physical connection linking 2 fundamentally different categories of land, one entirely natural and one entirely manufactured by human hands. A comprehensive 20-year structural review of the completed island has shown that its overall performance has consistently exceeded original engineering projections across virtually every measured category, from foundation stability to water quality management to long-term erosion resistance. Even now, more than 2 decades after ground was first broken on this project, the island continues actively growing, with new towers and hotel developments still rising along its fronds and crescent on a fairly regular basis. Roughly 40,000 individual workers ultimately spent 6 years of sustained, coordinated effort transforming what had once been nothing more than an unremarkable stretch of open ocean floor into one of the most photographed, most economically significant, and most genuinely astonishing pieces of engineered coastline anywhere on the planet. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment. An entire generation of children has now been born on this island, grown up walking these exact streets, attended these exact schools, and to them, none of this feels remarkable at all because they never knew a version of this coastline that wasn't already a palm tree traced in sand and rock, already humming with roads, villas, and streetlights glowing in a shape visible only from thousands of feet above their heads. That, in the end, might be the truest measure of whether a project like this actually succeeded, not the fireworks on opening night, not the record-breaking sand totals, not even the billions of dollars in eventual property sales, but the simple, almost boring fact that ordinary daily life now happens here without anyone giving a second thought to the impossible, engineering silently holding it all together beneath their feet.